What would you do if you were the new maid in a house where the most dangerous man on the coast had not eaten a real meal in years, where every plate came and went untouched, and he was slowly, quietly starving inside his own fortress, and you decided, against every rule you had been given, to cook him something honest, and watched him take a single bite and go utterly, dangerously still? They had warned her on her first day. "The master does not eat," they said. "Not really. Do not take it personally. Do not fuss. Set the plate down and take it away again." That is the whole of the job. And she had watched for a week as tray after tray came back to the kitchen exactly as it had left, and she had watched a powerful man grow grayer and thinner and colder at the edges, and something in her, the part that had never once been able to leave a hungry person hungry, had refused to accept it. So she had cooked from scratch with her own two hands the plainest and most honest thing she knew how to make, and she had carried it up herself and set it down, and he had looked at it the way a man looks at a threat, and then taken one bite and gone completely still and looked up at her as though she had done something impossible. This is a story of hidden worth, of a man starving in the middle of plenty, and of the woman whose honest hands reached him when nothing else on earth could. Esme Rowan had spent her whole life feeding people who never once thought to feed her. She was 30, soft and generously built, with warm hands and a warmer face, and a way of moving through a kitchen that made it feel instantly like the safest room in any house. She had learned young that a woman shaped like her was expected to be good at exactly one thing, which was serving others, and she had let the world believe that was the whole of her because it was safer than being seen. She had cooked in the kitchens of the rich and the cruel and the indifferent, and she had been paid little and thanked less and dismissed the moment a thinner, prettier face came along, and she had carried through all of it a quiet certainty about the one thing that was truly hers. What none of the households who used her ever bothered to discover was what Esme actually was underneath the apron they saw, and nothing else. Because Esme Rowan had a palate like almost no one alive. It was not a trick and it was not training, though she had plenty of that. It was a thing she had been born with and honed into something rare, a sense of taste and smell so acute that she could stand over a pot and name every hand that had touched it, could taste the single wrong note in a dish, could tell you what was in a thing, what did not belong in it, what had been added that should not have been. She had a memory that held every flavor she had ever encountered, and a tongue that could not be fooled. And she had spent a career quietly saving spoiled meals and catching bad ingredients that would have made a household sick, and never once being credited because the world did not expect a gift like that from a heavy, quiet woman who kept to the kitchen. And on the day everything changed, she took a position in the fortress of a man who could not bring himself to eat, and did not know that her impossible tongue was about to save his life. The man was Stefano Ricci, and he was the reason rooms had temperatures. He was tall and broad, dressed in a charcoal suit cut with lethal precision, the head of a syndicate that owned the ports and the freight lines, and the fear of every powerful family for 100 miles, and he was rumored to end a life with a single unhurried nod. He rarely raised his voice. He never needed to. And he was dying, slowly, in a way none of his enemies could have arranged, because years ago, at a long table in that very house, his father had been poisoned at a family dinner, and Stefano had watched the man die over a plate of food, and had nearly followed him, and something in him had closed around that memory like scar tissue. He could not eat. It was not a decision so much as a wound. Food had become the thing that killed the table, the place where death was served with the wine. And though he kept tasters and precautions and every safeguard money could buy, his body had learned to refuse nourishment out of a terror deeper than reason. He had grown thin and cold and hollow-eyed, a powerful man wasting inside his own walls, and no doctor and no cook and no threat had ever once reached the frightened core of him that equated a full plate with a coffin. Until a new maid who had not been broken by the warnings cooked him something with her own hands and carried it up herself. He looked at the plate, simple thing, a dish so plain and homely it belonged in a farmhouse and not a fortress, and every instinct told him to send it away, and then Esme Rowan did the thing that undid him. She did not set it down and retreat. She picked up a clean spoon, and she tasted it herself, right there in front of him, unhurried. And then she set the spoon down and said, in a low, calm voice, "I made every bit of this myself, with my own hands, from things I chose myself, and I just ate from it in front of you, and I will do that." Because a person should not have to be afraid of his own dinner, Stefano Ricci stared at her. And then, watched by a woman who had refused to let him starve, the most dangerous man on the coast picked up his fork and took one bite, and went utterly still, because it was the first food in years that had tasted like anything but fear, and because someone had looked at his terror and simply, quietly, refused to leave him alone in it. He ate the whole plate. It was the first full meal he had finished in longer than he could remember, and when it was done he sat looking at the empty dish as though it were a miracle. And then he looked at the soft, quiet woman who had made it, and something in the frozen heart of him cracked. He did not thank her, not then, because he had forgotten how. But the next evening he waited for her, and the evening after that. And Esme cooked for him with her own hands and tasted every plate in front of him. And slowly, meal by meal, the man who had been starving began to eat. The color came back into him, and the weight, and a low animal vitality that his people had not seen in years, and they whispered that the new maid had done something no one else could, and they were right. Because the thing about a man who has been dying of his own fear is that he has forgotten what it is to be cared for by someone who wants nothing from him. And Esme wanted nothing but for him to eat. She treated him not as a boss to be flattered or a monster to be feared, but as a person who was hungry. And she fed him, and in feeding him she reached the part of him that a decade of doctors had not. And Stefano, who trusted no one, began to trust the woman who tasted his food before he did. He began to look for her. In the kitchen, he began to talk to her while she cooked, and then to tell her things he had told no one about the father who had died at that table, and the trust he had learned to bury with him. And Esme unfolded too, because he did the thing no one had ever done, which was to treat her not as a pair of serving hands, but as a person of consequence, to ask her opinion and use it, to look at her while she was being brilliant about the one thing that was truly hers, and find it the most compelling thing in the room. Every evening she cooked and he ate, and afterward they sat over a decanter of amber whiskey he poured for himself, and a glass of wine she had chosen. And he learned she flinched at raised voices and softened at kindness, and it made him want to burn down everyone who had ever used her hands. And one night his hand rose to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek still faintly warm from the kitchen, and Esme, who had spent her whole life feeding people who never saw her, looked at a man who saw nothing else and did not pull away, and it undid them both. But Esme, being Esme, had begun to notice something wrong in that kitchen, a note that did not belong, and it would not let her rest. The cruelty came at a formal dinner. The first real one Stefano had hosted since he began to eat again. And it arrived wearing the confidence of a woman who had never once had to earn her place. Stefano had seated Esme at his right hand, in a gown of deep claret that celebrated every curve she had spent her whole life being told to hide, and midway through the evening, a sleek, beautiful woman named Renata, who had spent 2 years positioning herself to be the next Signora Ricci. "Oh, the cook!" Renata said brightly, loud enough for the room, letting her eyes travel over Esme's body with theatrical sympathy. "How quaint! They tell me he eats now because of you." She smiled like a blade. "How touching! But do try to understand what you are. Sweetheart, a man in a low place will cling to whoever brings him comfort. It is not love. It is convalescence. When he is strong again, and he is looking stronger every day, thanks to you, he will want a woman who belongs at the head of his table, not one who carries plates to it. Nobody, and I do mean nobody, looks at the fat girl from the kitchen and sees a wife. Do enjoy the meal." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. And the old Esme would have absorbed it, kept her face pleasant, gone quietly back to her kitchen. But something had been rebuilt in her, and she did not lower her eyes. "You are right that I come from the kitchen," Esme said, her voice quiet and perfectly level, "which is where I learned the one thing I do better than anyone in this house, which is to taste what is truly in a thing." She tilted her head, and something cold and certain came into her face. "And I have been tasting everything that comes out of that kitchen very carefully lately, Renata, because there is a note in it that should not be there, faint and bitter and patient, the kind of thing a person adds, a very little at a time. So, do be careful whose comfort you mock. She might be the only person in this house whose tongue can tell that someone is trying very quietly to finish what was started at this table years ago." The silence had teeth. Renata did not understand it. But a man standing just past her shoulder went the color of ash, and Stefano, who had crossed the floor in silence, took Esme's hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in front of the entire gathering. "You never make yourself small in this house again, Dolcezza," he murmured, using the endearment for the first time, the word for sweetness. "Not in my world, and never in front of me." But the man who had gone pale understood exactly what the cook had just said, because he was the one adding the note, and he had assumed, as everyone always assumed, that the woman from the kitchen was too far beneath notice to taste what he had so carefully hidden. The man was Marcello, Stefano Ricci's consigliere, and he had built his betrayal out of the one weapon that had already worked once in that house. It had been Marcello years ago who had arranged the poison that killed the old Don, and he had spent the years since as the patient, grieving right hand waiting, because Stefano's terror of food had done half his work for him. A boss who barely ate was a boss already half in the grave. And when the strange new maid had done the impossible and coaxed Stefano back to the table, back to strength, Marcello had simply returned to the old method. A faint, patient poison folded into the food, a very little at a time, meant to weaken the Don and to hand the family to the rival who had bought Marcello's loyalty 2 years before. It had been perfect, because no one tastes the food of a man everyone assumes is simply too frightened to eat. And then a woman with a tongue that could not be fooled had begun tasting every plate and had caught the one note in 1,000 that did not belong. Marcello smiled, thin and cold, and began, very quietly, to plan. It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Esme brought it to Stefano that night, and she brought it the way she brought everything, completely, and with the certainty of a woman who did not guess about flavors but knew them. She had gone back through everything the kitchen had produced with the tongue that missed nothing, and her palate did not lie. There was a poison in the food, subtle and slow, folded in with a cook's care, present in trace amounts in the dishes she had not made herself, absent entirely from the ones she had. It was the same faint bitterness she was certain that had been in the house for years, the same patient hand. And when she traced which meals carried it and which did not, when she thought about who had access to the kitchen supply and who chose the ingredients and who had been standing close to the old Don's plate the night he died, it led to a single person, the one man trusted enough to move through every part of that house unquestioned, the man who had stood at the family's shoulder for a generation. She laid it out on the table without drama, in order, the flavor, the pattern, the years of it. And Stefano Ricci went very still, and then he did the thing that undid her completely. He believed her instantly. He did not ask her twice. He did not send for a doctor to confirm what a cook had said. He looked at a case built from a bitterness on the tongue and a pattern in the plates, assembled by a woman the world had dismissed as a pair of serving hands, and understood in a single terrible moment that the thing that had killed his father and hollowed out his own life had a name and had been sitting at his side the whole time. "Marcello," he said quietly. "Yes," said Esme. Then he took her face in his hands and said, "If I move on him, and he sees it coming, he will not come at me. He will come at you, because you are the only person alive whose tongue can prove what he has done," and neither of them knew that Marcello had already made that decision. The fortress went dark at 2:30. Esme woke to a silence so complete it pressed against her skin, and every instinct a lifetime spent listening to a kitchen had honed screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. The power was out. The generators stayed dead. Stefano had been drawn out at midnight to a meeting she now understood was a fabrication. And Esme, sitting up in the dark, knew with terrible certainty that they had come while he was away, and that they had come for her, because she was the one who could taste the truth. She did not scream. She did not faint. She did not run blindly. She thought, cold and clear, the way she always had over a hot stove when everything was happening at once, and panic would have burned it all 2 floors below. A silenced weapon coughed, and a body met the marble. And Esme Rowan did the thing that no one in that house, friend or enemy, had ever thought to account for, because the one room in that fortress she knew better than any guard was the kitchen she had lived in for weeks. And a kitchen, to a woman who is not afraid, is not a soft and harmless place. It is the most dangerous room in any house. She moved through the dark by memory to the pantry office, where a hardwired line ran on its own circuit and got one message out. Then she did the thing the man in the dark could never have predicted, because a cook knows exactly what a kitchen can do to a body. She lit the great gas range and left the heavy pans to heat until they glowed. She poured a slick of oil across the tile inside the doorway. She set out within reach the things a kitchen holds that no soldier thinks to fear: the boiling stock pot, the caustic cleaners, the long knives, the scalding fat. and she waited in the dark of her own domain with the calm of a woman who had run a hot kitchen through 100 worse chaoses. The first man through the door went down hard on the oiled tile. The second came in fast behind him, and Esme, who did not panic, took the heavy pan from the range and swung it. And the searing metal did what searing metal does, and he went down screaming and did not get up. She did not gloat or freeze or run. She stepped over them and moved deeper into the kitchen she owned, toward the walk-in cold room she had noted on her first day, because a cook always knows where the heavy doors are. And she heard, behind her, the unhurried footsteps of Marcello, who had not rushed in with his men, who understood exactly what she had just done. "Esme," he said pleasantly into the dark. "Remarkable." He was moving carefully now, avoiding the slick. "Do you know, in all these years I never once feared the cook. I fed this family death for a generation and no one ever tasted it, because who suspects the food of a man too frightened to eat?" He paused, and then you walked in with that tongue and ruined the most patient work of my life. But you have made one mistake tonight. You are alone, and I am not. And I have spent a career learning where frightened things hide. And Esme Rowan, standing in the dark of her own kitchen, with her heart steady and her hands steadier, did the one thing he never expected. Because she was not, and had never once been, the frightened thing he took her for. "You have made the mistake, Marcello," she said. "Silence. You think you are hunting something afraid," she said, "but I have spent my whole life being overlooked by people exactly like you. And here is what that builds. In the end, a woman who is not afraid in the one room she understands better than anyone alive, and who tasted the truth you spent 20 years hiding. Your men are on my floor. One of them scalded, and both of them down. And everything I found, the poison, the pattern, the 20 years of it, the truth that you killed his father and have been killing him, is already gone, written out, dated, sitting with 3 people who will hand it to Stefano and the whole commission." She let it settle in the dark. "You built your whole life on the certainty that no one would ever taste what you did. You picked the worst possible house to hide poison in because you never once considered the cook." Marcello said nothing, which was the closest thing to a concession she would ever get. And in that silence, the front gates below exploded inward with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits. Stefano had come home. Time seemed to fracture. Gunfire erupted below, brief and brutal and absolute. Marcello lunged toward the sound of her breathing in the dark, and Esme, who knew every inch of that black kitchen the way she knew her own hands, stepped behind the heavy butcher's block she had known would be there and put it between them, and reached the great cold room door she opened and closed a dozen times a day, and was through it, and had swung the heavy latch before he understood she had moved. And then the corridor beyond flooded with light, and Stefano filled it, soaked in rain. Sandro, his loyal lieutenant, poured in behind him with a crowd of armed men, and the trap Marcello had spent a generation building snapped shut around him instead. Stefano had him by the throat against the wall before he could speak. "You poisoned my father at my own table," he said, "and you have been poisoning me for years, while I called you my most trusted man, and when a cook finally tasted it, you came into my house for her." Then he turned his head, and the murderous cold in his eyes dissolved into raw, naked fear. And he released Marcello to Sandro's men and crossed to the cold room door and hauled it open, and Esme stepped out into his arms. His hands moved frantically over her arms, her face, her shoulders, checking for blood, for wounds, for any harm to what was his. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Did he touch you? Look at me. Breathe. Tell me." "I'm all right," Esme said, steady even now, though her fingers curled into his soaked coat. I put one down with a hot pan and locked myself in the cold room. It turns out a kitchen is a very dangerous place if you know where everything is. And Stefano Ricci let out a broken, disbelieving laugh into her hair, and then he framed her face in his trembling hands and looked at her the way no one in her whole overlooked life had ever looked at her. "You are magnificent," he breathed. "He hid death in my food for 20 years, and no one ever tasted it. And you caught him in your first week with your own tongue." And then his voice cracked open entirely. "Do you know what I understood? The night you tasted my food in front of me," he said hoarsely, "that I had been starving for years inside my own house, and that a woman I did not deserve looked at my fear and simply refused to let me face it alone." He pressed his forehead to hers. "You did not just feed me, Dolcezza. You gave me back my own life, twice, and I intend to spend the rest of it at your table." Marcello, the man who had smiled at the Ricci family for a generation, while feeding them death, learned the price of underestimating her before the week was out. Stefano did not act in blind rage. He let Esme lay the whole of it before the commission, the poison in the plates, the pattern across the years, the truth that the old Don's murder and the new Don's slow wasting had been the same patient hand all along, all of it proven by a tongue that could not be fooled. And when the 5 families had seen the evidence, and the rival house that had bought Marcello a generation ago was exposed along with him, Esme did not counsel death. "You do not need to make him a martyr," she said quietly. "You need to make him nothing." So they did it her way. They stripped Marcello of every asset and exposed the generation of treason to the very families he had schemed to serve, and cast him out, alive, bankrupt, disgraced, a man whose name became a warning whispered at every table on the coast. A fate the old men agreed was far crueler than any quick and merciful bullet. And Renata, who had said that nobody looks at the fat girl from the kitchen and sees a wife, discovered that her own family had been entangled with the rival house, Esme's evidence exposed, and spent a long and humiliating season answering questions she could not answer well, and afterward watched from the far end of every table, every dish upon it prepared, at last, by hands that could be trusted. Months later, on a bright morning, washed gold with new sun, Esme Rowan stood in the great kitchen of the fortress, which she now ruled entirely, cooking for a man who ate like someone making up for lost years. And she did not make herself small for anyone anymore. She wore rich colors, tailored to celebrate every curve she had, spent her whole life being told to hide, and she took up exactly as much room as she pleased. Stefano came in and stopped, simply to watch her work, the way he had once watched a plate of honest food undo a decade of fear. "Or staring, Mr. Ricci," she said, mild in her voice. "I will never stop," he said, crossing to her and stealing a taste from the pot without a flicker of the old terror, because her food was the one thing on earth he no longer feared. "Do you know what I understood? The night you tasted my dinner in front of me," he said quietly. "That I had spent years believing the table was where death sat, and that a woman everyone had dismissed as a pair of hands had walked in and made it the safest place in my life again." He tilted her chin up, his eyes soft, in a way the rest of the world would never see, They called you the girl from the kitchen, dolcezza, as though feeding people were a small thing. And you turned out to be the only person alive who could taste the death in my own food and pull it out of me. You were never just a cook. You were the one who gave me back the will to live and then save the life you had given back. She looked up at the man the whole city feared, a man who bowed to no one, yet bowed entirely to her. And for the first time in her life, she believed she was exactly enough. She had spent her whole life feeding people who never once saw her, dismissed as serving hands, told a woman like her belonged in the kitchen and nowhere else. And she had proven every last one of those cruelties wrong, because the gift the world had refused to value had saved an empire and a life, and the man she had come to love, a powerful man, had been starving in the middle of plenty. And a cook, the whole world overlooked, had fed him, healed him, tasted the poison meant to kill him, and turned her own kitchen into the thing that saved them both. If Esme and Stefano's story of hidden worth, patient care, and hard-won love moved you, if your heart caught when the starving mafia boss took one bite of an honest meal and remembered how to live, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that the gift the world overlooks in you may be the very thing that saves everything. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us, what was your favorite moment in Esme and Stefano's story?